In our previous video on modern warfare, we discussed the Yom Kippur War's southern front in Sinai, but this wasn't the only arena in which the armies of Israel and the Arab nations fought. The Golan Heights, a buffer zone between Syria and Israel gained in 1967, was the site of a more urgent clash. Welcome to our second video on the Yom Kippur War, in which we will cover the northern front. If you are interested in the history of this era, don't forget to check out our second channel, The Cold War. The link is in the top right corner. Territorially, Syria's grievances against Israel revolved around the geographical region known as the Golan Heights, a strategic high ground in Israel's northeast, which had been a part of Syria before the 1967 war. Much like on the Suez Canal, the Israelis had also built a fortified defensive front on the Golan Heights, known as the Purple Line. It consisted of anti-tank ditches, 17 evenly spaced strongpoints known as mutvazim, and other obstacles, all of which cleverly used the inhospitable volcanic terrain as a force multiplier. Each of the 17 fortifications were garrisoned by 10 to 30 men. High-elevation volcanic cones were used as observation points and tank firing platforms, while debris from digging the anti-tank ditches was reused to form embankments, shielding the strongpoints from direct enemy hits. It's also worth noting that while the northern part of the Golan Heights was extremely bad terrain for tanks, the south was far more open. Movement of troops in this bulwark was facilitated by a network of tracks and roads built by the IDF. Two of them ran north to south, functioning as the main artery. Under the cover of their standard saber-rattling rhetoric, Syria began to mass a large force on its border with Israel, whose government was complacent. In total, around 40,000 Syrians were positioned against Israel's northeast flank, defended initially by only 200 Israelis. In terms of armour, Syria had 1,400 tanks against 177 Israeli and 115 artillery batteries against the IDF's 11. Assad had also taken the lead of his ally Egypt and possessed a formidable Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft umbrella, which it would use to repel the overwhelming effectiveness of Israeli warplanes. At 1:45 p.m. on October the 6th, just as Egyptian forces were about to cross the Suez on the southern front, spotters on Mount Hermon saw the Syrians removing camouflage nets from their artillery. Minutes later, a 50-minute-long preliminary barrage of shells began to fall all along the Israeli front on the Golan Heights. It was particularly intense in the sector between Rafid and Kenitra in the south, where the main thrust was planned. This bombardment was supported by airstrikes from Syrian planes, mostly Russian-made MiG-23s, which hit Israeli command centers and defensive positions. By 3 p.m., IDF Centurion tanks had mounted their firing ramps, preparing to engage the densely packed Syrian armoured columns now heading towards them. Three of the Syrian divisions, the 5th, 7th and 9th, moved forward along the entire line, under the cover of a creeping barrage. From the start, however, the central and northern divisions became disorganized in unfriendly terrain. Israeli tanks were ready and waiting for them to come across the entire front, firing accurately from their ramps at ranges up to 2,000 meters. They concentrated withering fire on the gaps that Syrian mine clearers had made in the minefields, and inflicted horrific casualties on the funneled enemy. Worthy of particular mention was the initial fighting for a vantage point known as Booster Ridge, from which the IDF's 188th Armoured Brigade fired down onto the plains below. Burned out Syrian T-55s slowly began to litter the battlefield, which would become known as the Vale of Tears. Despite inflicting heavy casualties, head of Israeli Northern Command, Major General Hoffi, realized that his outnumbered armour could not hope to hold back all of Syria's weight along the front by itself, so he began to organize and reinforce them, while Lieutenant Colonel Kahalani's infantry companies occupied blocking positions in the area of Booster Ridge. He was facing a numerically superior force which outnumbered him 15 to 1. Meanwhile, in the northernmost sector, Syrian mountain commandos managed to breach and eventually capture Israeli-held Mount Hermon. A subsequent attempt to retake the station failed with heavy losses when the attackers fell into a Syrian ambush. The mountain rangers who had ascended the mountain and captured the post would occupy it for almost the remainder of the war. All along the line, IDF forces were now under immense pressure. In the south, by 5 PM it was becoming increasingly clear that Syria's 5th Infantry Division was going to break through the Rafid Gap towards Juhada. That part of the line eventually crumbled as survivors from the region's strongpoints concentrated on slowing the Syrian push north up the TAP road, a push which, if successful, could roll up the entire Golan defensive line. The Syrian 5th Infantry continued to make progress after nightfall, fanning into 3 columns. The northernmost advanced along the TAP line before pushing west to Yehudia and the Arak Bridge, while the southernmost moved down the road from Rafid to El Al. The third split off and drove west from Ramat Magshimim. At this point, the Purple Line had been totally bypassed. 4 of the strongholds in the region of the breakthrough were evacuated in time, while the other half was encircled and isolated. Throughout the night, the 3 columns exploited the gains they had made, particularly in the center. Those forces advancing against Ramat Magshimim were pushing so quickly that they would soon descend unopposed into Israel's heartland. Victory in the south, it seemed, was almost near. In contrast to their successes in the south, Syrian forces in the north, who had a technological advantage in the form of night vision, were met with ferocious resistance during the previous night. At 10 PM, the Syrian 7th Infantry Division had launched another heavy attack in the Vale of Tears, but this was driven away after 3 hours of brutal close-quarters tank fighting. Despite the weight of Syria's numbers, by dawn they were stuck, trapped in the Vale, and could not advance further. As the sun rose on October 7th, Syrian forces in the south thought they had won. In the north, the view was far more grim. Over 100 burned out, damaged or destroyed T-55s. This 15-kilometer wide, 3-kilometer deep patch of land would be held by the Israelis, who suffered heavy casualties but knocked out 500 Syrian vehicles, including 300 tanks, losing only 100. Wanting to take as much advantage as they could as quickly as possible, Syrian High Command threw its armoured weight to the south, ordering reserves to bolster their armies in the form of the 15th Mechanized Brigade and 3rd Armoured Division. Attempts by Israeli air power to make a difference during the first days on the Golan Heights were swept away, with heavy losses inflicted by Syrian SAM batteries. During 2 attempted airstrikes in the centre of the line, for example, the IAF lost 6 out of 8 planes. By the 3rd day of the war in the north, 23 Israeli planes had been destroyed. During subsequent fierce fighting for the town of Nafek, where the IDF had a base, commander of southern Golan, Colonel Shoham, was killed. Only the hastily rushed in 679th Reserve Armoured Brigade, whose men had been civilians just hours before, blunted the Syrian assaults and protected the line's integrity. Realizing that the situation in the north was far more urgent than that in the Sinai, the IDF High Command decided to prioritize the Golan front, and began transferring new tank crews and additional units to the north from the battle against Egypt. These units gradually started to trickle in, starting on the afternoon of October 7th. At that point, there was only a thin screen of Israeli forces, commanded by Brigadier General Lana, between the Syrians and Galilee, and they were almost completely backed up against the slopes. Nevertheless, they managed to fight off enemy attempts to push them further, destroying 150 Syrian tanks in the process. The outcome of the war in the north hung by a thread, but Syrian High Command realized that they had to reorganize before any further push, and ordered their forces to halt at 5 PM. In the southernmost sector, armoured Syrian elements and parts of the 5th Infantry Division halted on the road to El Al, and the way was completely open. It proved to be a catastrophic decision, allowing Israel's reserves to mass. On the evening of October 7th, the 146th Reserve Armoured Division moved up the El Al road and prepared for battle. Only 36 hours after the war had begun, Israel was ready to launch a decisive counterstrike. Israeli forces in the south counterattacked through October 8th, and despite being struck by an enemy counterattack on the morning of October 9th, managed to push the Syrians back to their starting positions a day later. By nightfall on the 10th, there was not a single Syrian unit on territory west of the Purple Line. With this knowledge, Israel's cabinet had to decide whether to exploit its success against Syria or to concentrate forces against Egypt. Eventually, they decided to advance towards Damascus, hopefully close enough for long-range artillery bombardment, but not enough to provoke Soviet intervention. Major General Hoffi didn't intend to give the Syrians any time to recover, and began to quickly plan his assault. It would be launched as a concentrated thrust in the northern area of the front, which he correctly predicted would be less heavily defended than the south. The thrust's left flank and spearhead would rest on the slopes of Mount Hermon, while the right was just north of Kenitra. In the center and south, Israeli armies would remain on the defensive so as to focus all offensive strength in one area. The Syrians were now facing a reinvigorated enemy with their own badly mauled army. Moreover, the IAF was gaining advantage by destroying parts of the anti-air umbrella. The consequence was dire, enabling Israeli jets to inflict heavy strategic damage on Syrian infrastructure, hampering the Soviet effort to resupply its Arab ally. Other Allied military support, however, such as that from the Moroccans, Saudis, Iraqis and Jordanians, was being hurriedly assigned to sections of the front in order to delay the predicted Israeli attack. 2 brigades held the sector which was to come under the main assault, one Syrian and the other Moroccan, supported by 75 tanks. Built under Soviet supervision after 1967, the Syrian defensive zone across the front was around 15 kilometers deep, with closely integrated concrete bunkers and trenches. It was anchored on the right to Mount Hermon and on the left to the impassable basalt rock field known as the Lajat. The Northern Division under Brigadier Eitan's command began its attack at 11 am on the 11th of October under artillery cover, with the 7th Armoured Brigade as its spearhead. This force struck northeast beside the foothills of Mount Hermon towards the settlements of Hada and Mazrat Beit Jan. Advancing a few kilometers to the south were remnants of the Barak Brigade, which had been mauled in the prior Syrian advance. It pushed east through Jabhat el-Hashab and neared the operationally valuable heights of Tel Shams. By late afternoon, the 7th Armoured Brigade controlled the Hada crossroads and, on the morning of October 12th, managed to swat away an armoured counterattack and resume its advance, subsequently taking Mazrat Beit Jan after a 6-hour-long battle. The southernmost of Eitan's forces were making progress too, with the crucial Mads crossroads being taken at about the same time the 7th Armoured repelled the Syrian counterattack. An attack on the heights of Tel Shams itself by tanks under Yossi ben Hanan was repelled with heavy losses after Syrian anti-tank fire knocked the commander out of his turret. He was only rescued by paratroopers after darkness had fallen. To the south of Eitan's advance, Brigadier General Lanner's division, consisting of the 9th, 17th and 679th Reserve Armoured Brigades, began its own attack on the 11th at 1 pm, 2 hours after their companions to the north. They advanced up the Kenitra-Damascus road, but ran into trouble due to Israeli over-reliance on unsupported armour when it encountered well-coordinated Syrian defences. At the Khan Anaba crossroads, the 17th Reserve Armoured Brigade under Colonel Sarig came under a barrage of heavy artillery and anti-tank fire. When tanks at the rear of the column left the road in an attempt to get out of the way, they ran into minefields and suffered heavy losses. By the day's end, the 17th was down to a mere 5 tanks. Attempting to bypass the heavily defended crossroads, the 9th Armoured Brigade was ordered south through Jabba, but that night the units at Khan Anaba were briefly cut off by Syrian infantry, only to be saved by a battalion of Israeli paratroopers. On the morning of October 12th, Lanner launched a wide outflanking maneuver to the south through Nasej and towards Kanakir, which would hopefully avoid the terrible lava fields blocking his armour's path. His aim was to take Sassa from the south. Lana himself was positioned at his headquarters at Tel Shah, an elevated position which allowed him to watch his divisions advance over the Syrian plain. From there, however, he also noticed huge dust clouds being kicked up about 10 kilometers to the south. It was clear to any experienced tanker that a major armored formation was gearing up for action, and it turned out that this formation was the Iraqi 3rd Armored Division, 2 armored brigades and a mechanized brigade, totaling 180 tanks. To counter this threat, Lana ordered the 679th Reserve Armored Brigade to deploy south. The 205th was deployed between Tel Mashara and Tel El-Mal, while the 17th and 9th were to return from Kanekir and take up defensive positions facing south, at opposite ends of a formation which would look like a U-shape, with its points facing the Iraqis. It was a lethal trap. At around 8 AM on October 13th, the Iraqi forces advanced into the area between Mashara and Nasej, directly into the maw of Israel's armoured might. 200 tanks and 50 artillery pieces trained on them from 3 sides. As light first dawned that day, devastating concentric fire from all sides of Lana's so-called open box formation utterly annihilated the Iraqi 8th Mechanized Brigade within a matter of minutes. 80 tanks were destroyed, and the rest were sent reeling back in disarray, while not a single unit of IDF armor was even struck. To take advantage of this flattening of the Iraqi tanks, Lana then ordered his 9th Reserve Armored Brigade to seize the Tel Antar and Tel El Alakir hills throughout the 13th. The next morning, a hesitantly deployed Jordanian 40th Armored Brigade counterattacked after crossing into Syria to help, but was repelled after losing 20 Centurion tanks in much the same way as the Iraqis did. Nevertheless, the Israelis acknowledged that Jordanian armoured units were far more technically sophisticated than their other enemies. A series of attempted Arab counterattacks followed, but all of them were misconducted or were cancelled before being launched. This, in combination with the IDF switching its focus to the Sinai front, meant that a relative calm descended in the north beginning on the 17th. In that calm, Lana's division was relieved in the salient by Moshe Peled, who had been guarding the southern part of the front on the 1967 ceasefire line. In the far north, Eitan's units had managed to push doggedly forward despite increasing Syrian resistance. Israel's long-range M107 self-propelled artillery batteries began their bombardment of a military airfield near Damascus on the night of October 13th, strikes which would only intensify as the days went on. After a few days of stalemate, the Golan front's closing action was one designed to maneuver for position when the inevitable ceasefire came into effect, the recapture of Mount Hermon, lost at the beginning of the war. Men of the Golani Brigade, some in half-tracks and others slogging up the slopes on foot, managed to dislodge the entrenched Syrians by 1100 hours on the 22nd. At the same time, paratroopers landed near the Syrian observation post at the summit, repulsed a Syrian heliborne counterstrike, and then overran the station. Syria accepted a ceasefire proposed by the UN on the evening of October 22nd. But low-intensity fighting would continue well into the next year, as Israel refused to relinquish the Golan Heights. Finally, on May 31, 1974, the two nations signed a peace agreement, with Israel relinquishing a thin strip of territory west of the Purple Line. Syria lost 3,100 dead and 6,000 wounded, while Israel's losses were around 772 dead and 453 wounded. Unfortunately, the wars in the region would continue.